She was just sitting peacefully in her wheelchair when a millionaire's bodyguard violently threw her to the airport floor to make room for his boss's designer bags. 40 people watched in silence, too terrified to intervene against the powerful family. But they didn't notice the quiet man sitting in the corner, or the 90-pound military working dog at his feet. In a matter of moments, this off-duty Navy SEAL was about to unleash hell on the bullies, sparking a vicious courtroom battle that would change all of their lives forever. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments which country you are watching from. And if you love stories that melt your heart, please subscribe to support our channel. The air in Terminal 4 was a thick recycled soup of expensive perfume, burnt espresso, and the stale anxiety of 1,000 travelers. It was the kind of atmosphere that most people tried to ignore by burying their heads in their phones. But for Logan, ignoring his surroundings was no longer a biological option. He sat in a corner of the boarding lounge, his back against a solid concrete pillar, a position he had chosen with the subconscious precision of a man who spent his life calculating exit points and threat vectors. He was an active-duty Navy SEAL, a man whose body was a map of scars and whose mind was a high-speed processor for tactical data. His frame was lean and packed with the kind of functional muscle that looked like coiled wire beneath his plain gray t-shirt. A tactical cap was pulled low over his eyes, shielding them from the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights that hummed with a frequency only he seemed to notice. At his feet lay Coda, a 90-pound German shepherd with a coat the color of toasted sable, and eyes that held a depth of intelligence that was unnerving to the casual observer. Coda wasn't just a pet. He was a multi-purpose canine, a veteran of multiple deployments, wearing a black tactical vest with "Working Dog Do Not Pet" stitched in bold white letters. The dog's chin rested on Logan's heavy tan boot, but his ears were constantly twitching, tracking the roll of suitcases and the chime of the overhead announcements. They were both exhausted, coming off a high-intensity training cycle that had pushed them past the point of failure. Yet they remained in a state of relaxed readiness. They were waiting for a flight back to the base, a rare moment of transition between the chaos of the field and the structure of the barracks. A short distance away, the priority seating area was marked by a large blue sign with the international symbol for disability. It was a small island of relative calm in the sea of airport madness. Sitting there was Lena, a woman possessed of a quiet, unshakable dignity. She was paralyzed from the waist down, seated in a high-tech, lightweight wheelchair that looked more like an extension of her body than a piece of medical equipment. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored cardigan and had a book resting on her lap, her eyes moving steadily across the pages. There was a stillness about her that Logan respected, a sense that she was comfortable in her own skin, despite the limitations the world saw when they looked at her. She didn't look like someone who needed pity. She looked like someone who had survived her own version of a battlefield and had come out the other side with a different kind of strength. The peace was not meant to last. It was shattered, not by a scream or an explosion, but by the arrival of the Langford family. They didn't just walk into the lounge, they invaded it. Victor Langford led the way, a man in his 50s wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, his face set in a permanent expression of practiced irritation. Behind him was his wife, draped in a silk wrap and carrying a designer handbag like a scepter, followed by 2 teenage sons who moved with the performative boredom of the hyper-privileged. They were loud, their voices carrying across the terminal like an invasive species, drowning out the low hum of the crowd. They moved with a total lack of situational awareness, or perhaps a total disregard for it, expecting the world to bend around their momentum. "This is ridiculous," Victor Langford barked, his voice cutting through the lounge like a blade. "I told them we needed the lounge access, and now we're stuck out here with the masses. My back is killing me." He looked around the crowded seating area with visible disgust, his eyes finally landing on the priority zone. He didn't see the blue sign, or if he did, it didn't register as a command. He saw empty space and a single woman who was in his way. He gestured toward Lena with a flick of his wrist. "There. At least there's a bit of room over there. Boys, get the bags down before someone else takes the seats." The 2 sons didn't hesitate. They moved toward Lena with a casual dismissiveness that made the hair on the back of Logan's neck stand up. One of them, a tall boy with bleached hair and a designer sweatshirt, swung a heavy, oversized leather duffel bag onto the empty seat right next to Lena's wheelchair. The impact was loud, the metal buckles clattering against the plastic seat. He didn't even look at her. He just turned to his brother and laughed. "Finally, some legroom. I thought we were going to have to stand like peasants." Lena looked up from her book, her expression calm but firm. She closed the cover, keeping her finger in the page, and looked at the man who seemed to be the father. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice clear and level. "I don't mean to be a bother, but this is a designated priority area for travelers with disabilities. There are signs throughout the terminal for general seating just a few gates down." Victor Langford didn't even stop walking. He reached the area and stood directly over her, invading her personal space. He was a head taller than her even if she were standing, and he used that height as a weapon of intimidation. "Listen, sweetheart," he said, his tone dripping with a patronizing sweetness that was far more insulting than a shout. "We've had a very long day, and we've paid a lot of money for these tickets. I think we can all share a little space. It's not like you're using all these seats, are you?" "It's not about the number of seats," Lena replied, her voice remaining steady despite the man's proximity. "It's about the accessibility requirements. My wheelchair needs the clearance provided here so that I don't block the aisle for other passengers. It's a safety regulation as much as a courtesy." The wife, Camille Langford, stepped forward now, her nose wrinkled as if she had just smelled something unpleasant. "It's just a chair, dear. Can't you just roll it a few feet that way? Honestly, the entitlement of people these days is staggering. We just want to sit down as a family." She gestured vaguely toward the crowded hallway. "I'm sure there's plenty of room for you to park somewhere else." Logan watched the scene unfold from his pillar. His eyes narrowed. He felt Coda shift beside him, the dog's muscles tensing as he sensed the rising conflict. Logan's hand moved to the dog's head, a silent command to stay, but his own heart rate was beginning to climb. He had seen this kind of behavior before, in every corner of the world. It was the arrogance of those who believed their comfort was a universal priority, and that the rules were merely suggestions for the less fortunate. "I'm not moving," Lena said, and for the first time, a note of steel entered her voice. "This area is reserved for a reason. Please move your bags." Victor Langford's face darkened, the mask of polite irritation slipping to reveal a much uglier core. He looked at his sons and then back at Lena. "You're being very difficult," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "And I don't like difficult people. We're staying here. If you have a problem with it, you can call security. But I imagine they have better things to do than move a family, because a girl in a chair wants a little extra elbow room." He turned his back on her, signaling that the conversation was over. As he did, he stepped closer to her wheelchair, his heavy leather briefcase swinging by his side. It struck the wheel of her chair with a metallic thud. Lena flinched, her hands gripping the armrests. The sons began to pile more bags onto the surrounding seats, effectively boxing her in. They were laughing, talking about what they were going to do once they reached their destination, acting as if the human being sitting nearby was nothing more than a piece of inconvenient furniture. The tension in the air was palpable, a physical weight that made the surrounding travelers look away, fearful of the confrontation that was clearly coming. Logan didn't look away. He stood up slowly, Coda rising in perfect synchronization with him. The predator was awake. The air in the terminal seemed to vibrate with a low, predatory energy as Victor Langford turned his back on Lena, a gesture of ultimate dismissal that felt like a physical slap. Lena sat frozen for a heartbeat, her hands trembling slightly against the carbon fiber rims of her wheels, not out of fear, but out of a deep burning sense of injustice that she had spent years trying to navigate in a world not built for her. She looked at the wall of expensive leather luggage now surrounding her, a literal barricade constructed of vanity and greed. She took a breath, her voice smaller now, but sharper, like a needle. "Sir, I am asking you one last time to respect the regulations of this airport. You are obstructing a person with a disability, and you are creating a safety hazard. This isn't just about a seat. It's about the law." Victor Langford stopped mid-stride. He didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he let out a long, theatrical sigh, that made his son smirk. When he finally pivoted back toward Lena, the artificial mask of the successful businessman had crumbled completely, replaced by a face contorted with the petty rage of a man who had never been told no by someone he considered beneath him. He didn't look at her as a human being. He looked at her as a glitch in his perfect day, a nuisance that needed to be deleted. He didn't speak to Lena. Instead, he looked over his shoulder at a man who had been standing silently in the shadows of the boarding gate, a man who hadn't been noticed by the general crowd, but had been on Logan's radar since the moment he entered the terminal. The man, whose name was Roy Baxter, stepped into the light. He was a mountain of a human being, with a neck as thick as a tree trunk, and a buzz cut so sharp it looked like it could draw blood. He wore a tight black tactical polo shirt that strained against his massive chest, and khaki trousers that hid the heavy reinforced boots he wore. His eyes were flat, devoid of empathy, the eyes of someone who was paid not to think, but to execute. Roy was the Langfords' private security, a human shield for their arrogance, and he moved with a heavy thudding gait that cleared the crowded aisle without him saying a word. "Roy," Victor Langford said, his voice cold and dangerously quiet. "This lady is having some difficulty understanding the concept of sharing. She's being very disruptive. Clear the area. I want my family to have some peace before we board." The command was vague enough to offer legal cover, but the intent was unmistakable. Roy didn't hesitate. He didn't ask Lena to move again. He didn't offer to help her. He simply stepped forward, his massive frame blotting out the light from the terminal windows. Lena looked up at him, her eyes wide, her breath hitching in her throat. She tried to back her wheelchair away, but the Langfords' bags were piled too high behind her, trapping her in a corner of the seating row. The surrounding passengers finally realized that the verbal sparring was about to turn into something much darker. A woman nearby gasped, clutching her child's hand, but she didn't step forward. A man in a business suit looked up from his laptop, frowned, and then immediately looked back down, choosing the safety of his digital world over the reality of the assault unfolding nearby. Roy reached out with one massive, calloused hand. He didn't grab Lena. He grabbed the armrest of the wheelchair, his fingers sinking into the padding. "You heard the man?" Roy grunted, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. "You're in the way." With a violent, sudden jerk, he didn't just pull the chair. He lifted the side of it and shoved. It was a movement born of pure, unnecessary cruelty, a display of power meant to humiliate as much as to remove. The physics of the moment were agonizingly clear. The lightweight, precision-balanced wheelchair was never meant to withstand a lateral force of that magnitude. It tipped instantly. Lena let out a short, sharp cry of surprise that was cut off as her body was thrown sideways. Because she had no sensation or control below her waist, she couldn't brace her legs or use them to catch her weight. She was a passenger in her own fall. Her shoulder hit the hard, unforgiving linoleum first, followed by the sickening thud of her hip. The wheelchair, freed of her weight, clattered and spun across the floor, its wheels whirring uselessly in the air like an upturned beetle. Lena lay on the ground, her cream cardigan bunched up, her book sprawling several feet away, pages fluttering in the draft of the air conditioner. The sound of the impact was horrific. It wasn't just the noise of a body hitting the floor. It was the sound of a person's dignity being shattered in a public space. For a few seconds, the entire terminal went silent. The hum of the lights seemed to grow louder. The Langfords stood there, the sons looking momentarily stunned while Camille simply adjusted her silk wrap and looked away, as if the sight of a woman lying on the floor was a breach of etiquette she couldn't be bothered with. Victor Langford didn't move to help. He just looked at Roy and gave a short, sharp nod of approval. "There," Victor said, his voice devoid of any remorse. "Now we have some room. Roy, move that chair out of the aisle." Lena didn't move. She lay there, one cheek pressed against the cold floor that smelled of industrial floor wax and the thousands of shoes that had walked over it. Her hair had come loose from its clip, spilling across her face. She wasn't crying, not yet. She was in a state of profound shock, her brain trying to process the fact that in a room full of people, in a modern city, in broad daylight, she had been physically discarded like trash. The pain was starting to radiate from her shoulder, a dull, throbbing ache that signaled a dislocation or worse. But it was the silence of the crowd that hurt more. The dozens of people in the immediate vicinity were frozen, their faces a gallery of cowardice and bystander apathy. But the silence didn't last. It was broken by a sound that came from the corner of the lounge, a sound that wasn't human. It was a low, vibrational growl, a sound that started in the chest of a predator and traveled through the air like a warning from the abyss. Kota was no longer lying down. He was standing, his front paws planted wide, his head lowered, and his upper lip curled back to reveal teeth that had been trained to tear through tactical gear. The fur along his spine was standing in a jagged ridge, and his eyes were locked on Roy with a terrifying, singular focus. Logan stood beside him, but he wasn't the same man who had been slumped against the pillar moments ago. His posture had shifted into something lethal. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by the cold, crystalline clarity of a SEAL who had just identified a high-priority target. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He moved with a terrifying, silent economy of motion, stepping over his own bag and walking toward the center of the zone. Every step he took was a promise of retribution. The air around him seemed to chill, and the passengers who had been looking away suddenly found themselves unable to tear their eyes from the man in the gray t-shirt and the black dog. Roy heard the growl and turned, his chest puffing out as he saw Logan approaching. He cracked his knuckles, a slow, confident smile spreading across his face. He saw a man smaller than him, a dog on a leash, and he assumed he was still the most dangerous thing in the room. He had no idea that the timer on his arrogance had just hit 0. In a matter of moments, the terminal would witness the difference between a bully with a paycheck and a warrior with a purpose. The transition from stillness to violence was not a gradual escalation. For Logan, it was a binary switch, a sudden shift in the molecular structure of the air surrounding him. To the panicked onlookers in Terminal 4, Logan became a blur of gray and shadow, a professional predator moving through a flock of startled sheep. He did not run. Running was for amateurs who wasted energy. Instead, he moved with a terrifying, ghost-like efficiency, his body low and his center of gravity perfectly balanced, closing the gap before Roy could even finish his smirk of triumph. Roy saw the dog first. Kota was a 90-pound missile of fur and muscle, launched with a single unspoken command that resonated through the leash. The German shepherd did not bark. Barking was a warning, and the time for warnings had passed when Lena hit the floor. Kota left the ground a few feet away from the bodyguard. His body extended in midair like a living weapon. He didn't go for the throat or the limbs with his teeth. He was a Tier 1 military working dog trained for non-lethal apprehension in high-tension environments. Kota used his entire body weight as a blunt force instrument, striking Roy squarely in the center of his massive chest. The impact sounded like a heavy sandbag hitting a stone wall. Roy, for all his gym-grown muscle and bravado, was caught completely off balance. The air left his lungs in a sharp wheezing sound as the dog's momentum carried them both to the floor. Kota pinned the man instantly, his front paws on Roy's shoulders and his snout inches from the man's eyes, a low, vibrating growl serving as a physical weight that kept the bodyguard paralyzed with pure primal terror. Simultaneously, Logan reached Victor Langford. The businessman, seeing his hired muscle neutralized in a heartbeat, felt the first cold spike of genuine fear pierce his arrogance. He reacted the only way a cornered bully knows how, with uncoordinated aggression. He swung his heavy leather briefcase at Logan's head, a clumsy, wide arc that Logan didn't even bother to dodge. Instead, Logan stepped into the strike, his left hand rising to catch the man's forearm, while his right hand found a specific pressure point behind the jaw. It was a movement of surgical precision. With a slight twist of his wrist and a shift of his weight, Logan used Victor's own momentum against him. The briefcase clattered to the floor, and the wealthy patriarch found himself spun around, his arm locked behind his back in a shoulder-wrenching hold that forced him to his knees, right next to the woman he had just ordered to be discarded. The two Langford sons tried to intervene, but they were halted by the sheer intensity of Logan's gaze. He looked at them over his shoulder, his eyes cold and devoid of any human heat, and the boys froze. They were teenagers, products of expensive private schools and zero consequences, and they had never seen a man who looked like he could dismantle them without breaking a sweat. They stayed where they were, hands half raised, looking like statues of cowardice. In the wake of the action, the terminal returned to that strange, suffocating silence, broken only by the whirring of Lena's overturned wheelchair and the distant chime of a flight boarding in another gate. Logan maintained his grip on Victor, his voice coming out as a low, dangerous rasp that was barely more than a whisper. "The lady asked you to move your bags," Logan said. There was no anger in his voice, which made it 10 times more terrifying. It was the voice of a man who was simply stating a law of nature. "You chose to hurt her instead. That was a tactical error." He applied a fraction more pressure to the arm lock, and Victor let out a strangled whimper, his face turning a mottled shade of purple against the gray floor. Lena was still on the ground, but she had managed to prop herself up on one elbow. Her hair was a mess, and her face was pale, but her eyes remained sharp, tracking the movements of the man in the gray t-shirt. She saw the way Coda held the bodyguard, the way the dog's ears were back, and his focus was absolute. She saw the working dog vest and the professional, controlled violence of Logan's movements. She realized then that she wasn't being saved by a random Good Samaritan. She was being protected by a professional who operated on a level of discipline she had only read about in classified reports. The silence was finally shattered by the heavy, rhythmic thud of combat boots and the jangle of metal. "Security! Everyone stay where you are!" The voice belonged to Officer Dwayne Holt, a tall, no-nonsense man in a dark blue airport security uniform, followed by 3 other officers with their hands on their holsters. They rushed into the priority zone, their eyes darting between the man on his knees, the bodyguard pinned by a dog, and the woman on the floor. To a newcomer, the scene looked chaotic and incriminating. They didn't see the shove. They only saw the aftermath, where the wealthy-looking family was being held down by a man who looked like he belonged in a combat zone. "Drop the man! Call off the dog now!" Officer Holt shouted, his taser drawn and leveled at Logan's chest. The other officers moved to flank the area, their faces tense. The surrounding passengers, sensing the shift in authority, began to mutter. The Langfords, realizing their rescue had arrived, immediately flipped the script. "Thank God!" Camille shrieked, her voice reaching a glass-shattering pitch. She rushed toward the officers, pointing a trembling finger at Logan. "This man is a lunatic. He just attacked us. He set his dog on our security guard. Look at my husband. He's going to break his arm. Arrest him. Arrest him right now." Yo. Victor, sensing the opening, began to moan loudly, exaggerating his discomfort. "He's crazy. I think he's a terrorist. He just came out of nowhere. We were just sitting here and he started screaming and throwing us around." He looked up at Officer Holt with a look of feigned agony. "Please, get this animal away from my man before it kills him." Roy, still pinned by Coda, didn't move an inch, but he started yelling too. "He's got a weapon. I saw a knife. The dog is out of control." It was a coordinated lie, a defensive perimeter of falsehoods designed to bury the truth under a mountain of urgent accusations. The 2 sons joined in, their voices overlapping in a frantic chorus of, "He hit us first," and "He's dangerous." Officer Holt looked at Logan, his jaw set. "Sir, I will not ask you again. Release him and secure the dog or we will use force." Logan didn't panic. He looked at the taser pointed at his heart, then at the officers, and then down at Lena. He saw the way the officers were looking at him, seeing the tactical cap and the muscular build and the aggressive dog, and he knew exactly how this was going to go. He knew that in the eyes of the law at this moment, he was the primary aggressor. He slowly, deliberately released Victor's arm and stepped back, his hands raised and open, a gesture of compliance that was as controlled as his attack had been. "Coda, heel," Logan said firmly. The German shepherd instantly disengaged from Roy, backing away with a final warning snap of his jaws before sitting perfectly at Logan's left heel. The dog's focus never wavered from the threat, but he was once again the picture of military discipline. Roy scrambled to his feet, gasping for air, while Victor stayed on the floor for a moment longer to ensure the officers saw his injuries. "On your knees, hands behind your head," Officer Holt commanded. One of the other officers moved in with handcuffs. "Officer, wait," Lena tried to say, her voice struggling to rise above the Langfords shouting. "He was helping me. They pushed me. They threw me out of my chair." But Camille was already in Officer Holt's ear, her expensive perfume clashing with the tension in the air. "Don't listen to her. She's probably his accomplice. Did you see what that dog did? It's a menace to society. My husband needs a doctor. We are filing charges. We want the maximum penalty." The handcuffs clicked shut around Logan's wrists, the cold metal a familiar and unwelcome weight. He didn't protest. He didn't try to explain. He knew that in a battle of words between a man in a gray t-shirt and a family with a private lawyer on speed dial, the truth was often the first casualty. As he was led away, he looked back at Lena, who was being held up by a flight attendant. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and horror as she watched the man who saved her being treated like a criminal. The Langfords were already huddled together, whispering and pointing, their faces shifting from fear back to the smug, untouchable confidence of the ultra-rich. The battle of the terminal was over, but the war for Logan's life and Coda's survival had just begun. The metallic click of the handcuffs was the sound Logan knew all too well, though usually he was the one applying them to high-value targets in dark corners of the world. Now, the cold steel bit into his own wrists, a jarring reminder that on home soil, his specialized skills were viewed not as a shield, but as a liability. As Officer Holt tightened the ratchets, the sound cut through the hushed terminal like a gunshot, effectively ending the chaotic violence and beginning the slow, bureaucratic strangulation of the truth. Logan stood tall, his gaze fixed on a point just above the horizon, his face a mask of stone, even as the Langfords began their coordinated performance for the growing crowd of onlookers and security personnel. The walk through Terminal 4 was a masterclass in public humiliation. Logan was led away not as a protector, but as a dangerous offender flanked by armed officers, who maintained a wary distance as if they expected him to explode at any moment. The surrounding travelers, the same people who had stood frozen in silence while Lena was assaulted, now found their voices. They whispered and pointed, their faces twisted with the easy judgment of people who felt safe behind a police line. He could hear the snippets of their conversation, the words animal, thug, and terrorist, drifting through the air like toxic smoke. This was the first hook of his new reality, a question planted in the mind of every witness. How could a man who looked like a hero act like a monster? But the true heartbreak occurred at the terminal exit. A white van from the city's animal control division was already waiting, its orange lights flashing with a sterile predatory rhythm. Two men in thick, bite-resistant canvas jackets approached Coda. The German shepherd, sensing the impending separation, let out a sound that Logan had only heard once before during a midnight extraction in a desert wasteland. It was a low, mournful keen, a vibration of pure, soul-deep anxiety. Coda didn't snap or growl at the animal control officers. His training was too deep, his discipline too ingrained. He simply looked at Logan, his amber eyes pleading for a command that would make sense of this madness. "He's a military working dog," Lena cried out, her voice cracking as she struggled to push her damaged wheelchair toward the van. A flight attendant held her back, citing safety regulations. "He's a veteran. You can't just put him in a cage. He hasn't done anything wrong." Her pleas were ignored. The animal control officers used a catch pole, the heavy wire loop tightening around Coda's neck, an indignity that made Logan's jaw tighten until it ached. They didn't see a decorated combat veteran. They saw a liability with dangerous potential. They shoved Coda into a cramped metal-reinforced kennel in the back of the van and slammed the door. The sound of that door closing was the sound of a bond being severed, a tactical dislocation that left Logan feeling more vulnerable than he ever had in enemy territory. While Logan was being processed in the windowless, fluorescent-lit basement of the airport police station, the Langford family was being treated like royalty in a private lounge upstairs. Victor Langford sat on a plush leather sofa, a bag of ice pressed to his shoulder, and a glass of premium mineral water in his hand. He wasn't talking to the police. He was talking to his lawyer, a man named Damien Cross, who had arrived in record time carrying a briefcase full of legal precedents and intimidation. "The narrative is simple, Victor," Damien whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of any moral weight. "You were a victim of a random, unprovoked attack by a man with a history of military violence. Your sons are traumatized. Your security guard was nearly mauled. We aren't just filing charges, we are shaping the public record." Outside the lounge, Officer Holt was trying to take a statement from Lena. She sat in her chair, her shoulder throbbing with a pain she refused to acknowledge, her eyes burning with a cold, analytical fire. She told the truth, meticulously and calmly. She described the shove, the verbal abuse, and the way the Langfords had boxed her in. She described Logan's intervention as a controlled, proportional response to an active assault. Officer Holt listened, his pen hovering over the notepad, but his eyes kept drifting toward the private lounge where the local chief of police was currently shaking hands with Victor Langford. The pressure was invisible, but absolute. Langford wasn't just a traveler. He was a major donor to the city's political campaigns, and a man who could end a police officer's career with a single phone call. "Look, miss," Officer Holt said, his voice lowering. "I appreciate your perspective, but we have multiple witnesses, including 2 minors and a professional security guard, who say the man in the gray shirt initiated physical contact. They say he used his dog as a weapon. In the eyes of the law, that's assault with a deadly instrument." "He saved my life," Lena snapped, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "They pushed me out of my chair. If he hadn't stepped in, that bodyguard would have done much worse." "The video is inconclusive," Officer Holt said, his gaze shifting to the floor. "There's a blind spot near the priority seating. All we see clearly is the dog attacking the guard and your savior putting Mr. Langford in a joint lock. Everything else is just your word against theirs, and their word carries a lot of weight in this town." By the time Logan was moved to a holding cell at the county jail, the story had already been written. The local news was running a segment titled, "Violence in the Skies, Navy SEAL and Dangerous Dog Arrested After Airport Brawl." The report featured a grainy photo of Logan in handcuffs and a high-definition interview with a tearful Camille, who described her terror at being hunted by a wild animal. There was no mention of the priority seating zone. No mention of Lena. The truth had been professionally sanitized, replaced by a convenient fiction that protected the powerful and vilified the protector. In his cell, Logan sat on the edge of the hard plastic cot. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that allowed the ghosts of his past to whisper in the darkness. He thought about Coda in a cold concrete kennel, confused and alone. He thought about Lena, wondering if she was okay, if anyone had helped her fix her chair or find her book. He felt a surge of conflicting emotions, the pride of doing what was right, clashing with the bitter realization that in the world he fought for, doing what was right often carried the highest cost. He knew the Langfords would try to bury him. He knew they would use their money to buy witnesses and influence the prosecution. He knew that the system was currently geared to crush him to maintain the comfort of the wealthy. But as he stared in the reinforced steel door of his cell, Logan didn't feel like a victim. He felt like a man who was simply behind enemy lines, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The Langfords thought they had won because they controlled the police and the press. They had no idea that they had just made an enemy of a man who specialized in winning against impossible odds, and a woman who saw the world in patterns of data that no lawyer could ever hide. The questions were raised, the stakes were set, and the true hook was just beginning to take hold. The interview room at the county jail was a masterclass in psychological claustrophobia. The walls were painted a shade of gray that seemed designed to drain the color from a person's soul, and the single fluorescent light overhead hummed with a persistent, irritating frequency that vibrated inside Logan's skull. There was no window, only a heavy steel door with a sliding slit, and a cold, bolted-down table that sat between 2 mismatched chairs. Logan sat in one of those chairs, his hands uncuffed now, but his posture still rigid, a habit of discipline that no amount of incarceration could break. He had been in this room for some time, ignored by the guards, left alone with the silence and the growing weight of the unknown. He wasn't thinking about the charges or the legal fees. He was thinking about the way Coda's tail had tucked between his legs when they shoved him into that van. He was thinking about the look of absolute betrayal in the dog's eyes. The heavy door groaned on its hinges, and a man stepped inside who looked like he had been manufactured in a factory that specialized in predatory litigation. This was Damien Cross, a senior associate from the firm representing the Langford family. Damien was in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair slicked back so tightly it looked like a helmet. He wore a charcoal-colored suit that was tailored with mathematical precision, and a silk tie the color of dried blood. He didn't look like he belonged in a jail. He looked like he belonged on a yacht or in a boardroom deciding the fate of thousands. He carried a slim leather portfolio and a sense of entitlement so thick it practically displaced the air in the room. He didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he pulled out a pristine white handkerchief, wiped the seat of the empty chair, and then sat with a delicate, practiced grace. "Mr. Hale," Damien began, his voice smooth and cultivated, the kind of voice that had never had to shout to be heard. "My name is Damien Cross. I represent the Langford family. I'm here because my clients are, believe it or not, people of great compassion. They recognize that you are a man who has served his country, a man who has clearly seen things that would break a lesser individual. They understand that sometimes that kind of trauma can manifest in unfortunate ways. They don't want to see a Navy SEAL's life ruined over a single impulsive afternoon at an airport." He paused, waiting for a reaction. Logan gave him nothing. He sat as still as a statue, his eyes locked on Damien's with a flat, unsettling intensity that had made enemy combatants hesitate in the field. Damien cleared his throat, a small flicker of annoyance crossing his face before he smoothed it over with a shark-like smile. "Here is the situation. You are currently facing multiple counts of felony assault. You used a trained animal as a deadly weapon. You inflicted a painful injury on a professional security guard. The district attorney is already looking at a significant minimum sentence, especially given the high-profile nature of the victims. However, the Langfords are willing to offer you a way out, a complete dismissal of all charges. Your military record stays clean. You walk out of here tonight." Logan spoke for the first time, his voice a low, dry rasp. "And what's the catch?" Damien opened his portfolio and slid a single sheet of paper across the table. "Not a catch, Mr. Hale. A reconciliation. This is a prepared statement. In it, you will admit that you suffered a momentary lapse in judgment due to post-traumatic stress. You will acknowledge that the Langfords were in no way aggressive and that you misunderstood the situation. You will offer a full public apology for your actions and for the unprovoked attack by your dog. Finally, you will agree to a voluntary discharge from the Navy on medical grounds. In exchange, the Langfords drop everything. It's a clean slate. You go home, find a quiet life, and we all move on." Logan didn't even look at the paper. "You want me to lie. You want me to tell the world that Lena wasn't pushed. That your clients weren't bullies, and that I'm a broken man who can't control himself. You want me to trade my honor for my freedom." Damien leaned forward, the smell of his expensive cologne clashing with the scent of bleach in the room. "Honor is a very expensive luxury, Logan, and right now you're bankrupt. But if your own future doesn't concern you, perhaps the dog's does." He took out a second document, this one with a red stamp at the top. "Your German Shepherd, Coda, because he attacked a human and caused significant injury, he has been classified as a dangerous animal. Under city ordinance, that carries a mandatory euthanasia order. He is currently being held in a high-security kennel at the animal shelter. If you sign this agreement, the Langfords will use their influence to reclassify the incident as a training mishap. The dog will be released to a private farm where he can live out his days. If you refuse," Damien let the sentence hang in the air like a noose, "if you go to trial, that dog will be destroyed before the first witness is even called. We will make sure of it." The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Logan's hands resting on the table slowly balled into fists, the knuckles turning white. The threat was a surgical strike aimed directly at the only thing Logan had left to lose. They weren't just asking for a confession. They were asking him to let them kill his partner's soul or kill his body. The silence stretched for a long minute. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall and the heavy thrum of Logan's own heart. He thought of Coda, the way the dog had stayed by his side through deployments, the way he had sensed Logan's nightmares before they even started. "You think you've won?" Logan said, his voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a death sentence. "You think because you have the money and the lawyers, you can rewrite what happened in that terminal? But you're forgetting something. You're not dealing with a civilian. You're dealing with a SEAL. We don't negotiate with people like you." Damien's smile vanished, replaced by a cold, hateful sneer. He stood up, snapping his portfolio shut with a sharp crack. "Very well. Have it your way, Mr. Hale. You want to be a martyr? Fine. But know this. By the time I'm done with you, the public won't see a hero. They'll see a violent, unstable veteran who set a monster on a family. And as for the dog, I'll personally make sure the injection is administered. You had a chance to save him, and you chose your ego instead." Damien turned and signaled the guard to open the door. He walked out without looking back, his expensive shoes clicking arrogantly on the linoleum. Logan was left alone in the gray room, the light humming louder than ever. He looked at the empty chair where the lawyer had sat, and for a split second, a wave of pure, unadulterated agony washed over him. He had refused the deal, but the cost was a nightmare he wasn't sure he could survive. He closed his eyes and saw Coda's face. And in the darkness of that jail cell, Logan made a vow. He wasn't just going to fight for his life. He was going to burn down the Langford's world of lies, brick by brick, until there was nothing left but the truth. He just hoped Lena was doing the same. The courtroom was an arena of cold mahogany and institutional judgment, a place where the scent of old wood and industrial disinfectant was punctuated by the sharp, sterile hum of overhead lights. Margaret Shaw, a prosecutor with years of trial experience and a face like a sharpening stone, stood before the jury with the practiced authority that makes defense attorneys nervous. She didn't look at Logan as a man who had served his country. She looked at him as a piece of incriminating evidence to be dismantled. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice a low, rhythmic instrument of condemnation. "This case is about unprovoked, excessive violence committed by the defendant against unarmed civilians." She spoke with a certainty that left no room for nuance, painting a picture of a man trained to be a weapon who had forgotten that he was no longer on a battlefield. She framed Logan's tactical training, not as a service, but as a dangerous expertise wielded against a family that was simply trying to enjoy their afternoon. Victor Langford sat in the second row, wearing a tailored suit and a medical sling that looked far more expensive than any legitimate bandage. He projected the calm, untouchable confidence of a man who had already purchased the outcome of the day before the first word was spoken. Besides him, Camille occasionally touched a silk handkerchief to her eyes, a performance designed for the benefit of the local reporters who had been tipped off about the violent veteran. The jury, a collection of ordinary citizens, watched with wide eyes as Margaret described the vicious animal that had savagely mauled a professional security guard. By focusing on the injuries and the fear, she was using the strategy of raising questions about Logan's stability to keep the jury's attention focused exactly where she wanted it. She avoided too much description or info dumping, instead getting the jury invested in the supposed trauma of the Langford family. When Victor Langford took the stand, the transformation into a victim was complete. He spoke in a low, trembling voice about his desire to protect his sons and the utter shock he felt when he was viciously attacked by the defendant. "I was just trying to help my family find a place to sit," he lied, his eyes fixed on the jury foreman with an expression of manufactured sincerity. "And then this man, he just went crazy. He set his dog on us. I thought my son was going to die." He limped slightly as he returned to his seat, a detail that was not supported by any medical evidence, but was perfect for the theater of the courtroom. Roy, the bodyguard, followed with a testimony that described Coda as a bloodthirsty monster that had been trained to kill, carefully omitting the fact that the dog hadn't even broken his skin. The conflicting ideas of Logan as a hero versus Logan as a threat created a tension in the room that was almost physical. Logan's public defender, Tyler Quinn, stood to cross-examine, but he looked like a man trying to stop a tidal wave with a toothpick. Tyler was carrying a caseload that was physically impossible to manage, and his idealism was rapidly diminishing under the weight of the Langford family's influence. Every time he tried to bring up the priority seating sign or the fact that Lena had been pushed, Margaret was on her feet with an objection that the judge, Eleanor Graves, almost always sustained. Judge Graves had been presiding over trials for years, and she knew the weight of the Langford name in this county. The defense seemed disorganized, weak, and ultimately futile. Logan sat at the defense table, his hands clasped, his face a mask of iron discipline, even as the lies were piled high around him. He felt the emotional connection to the protagonist's suffering that the script's advice suggested was the best way to hook an audience. The climax of the afternoon came when Margaret addressed the judge for her closing request of the session. "Your Honor, the defendant is a trained killer. He has shown that he is unable to reintegrate into a peaceful society without resorting to the violence he learned in the military. In light of the permanent psychological and physical damage he has caused, the state seeks the maximum prison sentence." She paused, turning her gaze toward the empty space next to Logan where Coda should have been. "Furthermore, the animal involved has proven itself to be a threat to public safety that cannot be rehabilitated. We request a court order for its immediate destruction." The word destruction hit the room like a hammer, and for the first time, Logan's composure cracked. It wasn't a shout or a move, just a tightening of the jaw so intense it was visible from the gallery. He wasn't fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for the life of the only partner who had never abandoned him. Lena sat in the back row of the gallery, her damaged wheelchair tucked into the aisle, her face unreadable as she watched the prosecutor's victory lap. She had been silenced by the legal maneuvering of the Langford's lawyers, prevented from testifying because of a procedural error that Damien had manufactured. But as Margaret sat down, smug and certain of her win, Lena's hand moved to the small encrypted tablet resting on her lap. She wasn't just a woman in a chair. She was a woman with access to the kind of data that the Langford's money couldn't reach. She watched the judge prepare to adjourn, and a cold, sharp smile touched her lips. The Langfords thought they were the only ones who knew how to use power, but they were about to find out that a Navy SEAL and a Pentagon analyst were the wrong people to push into a corner. The question remained, what happens next when the truth finally broke through the wall of money? The air in the courtroom shifted the moment Tyler Quinn called his final witness. Until this point, the prosecution had successfully framed the narrative as a simple case of a violent veteran and his dangerous animal, a story that fit the biases of a jury and the interests of a powerful family. But as Lena maneuvered her wheelchair toward the front of the room, there was a different kind of energy following her, a cold and calculated stillness that began to raise questions in the minds of everyone present. She didn't look like the victim the Langfords had tried to erase. She looked like an architect of a coming storm. Victor Langford shifted in his seat, his confidence flickering for the first time as he watched the woman he had physically discarded prepare to speak. Margaret Shaw, the prosecutor, was on her feet before Lena even reached the stand. "Your Honor, I must object. Dr. Vargas has already been excluded from the witness list due to procedural delays. Her testimony is irrelevant at this stage of the trial." Tyler Quinn didn't back down. He stood with a posture that had finally found its spine, looking at the judge with a sharp, piercing focus. "Your Honor, the witness's identity and the evidence she carries were previously classified under national security protocols. Those restrictions were lifted exactly moments ago. This isn't just a witness. This is a revelation that goes to the very heart of the truth." Judge Graves leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at Lena. "State your name and occupation for the record." Lena adjusted the microphone, her voice resonating through the wood-paneled room with the clarity of a bell. "My name is Dr. Lena Vargas. I am a senior intelligence analyst with the Department of Defense, currently stationed at the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, a surprising and shocking revelation that immediately seized the audience's attention. The disabled woman they had spent days hearing about was actually a high-level government official. The Langford's lawyer, Damien, looked as though he had been struck, his face turning a ghostly shade of white. This was a hook that redefined the stakes of the story, transforming a local assault case into a matter of federal interest. "Dr. Vargas," Tyler began, his voice steady, The prosecution has claimed that the security footage from the airport was inconclusive. Can you explain why? Because the airport security system is managed by a private contractor with ties to the Langford Group, Lena said, her eyes locking onto Victor Langford with an intensity that made him flinch. They provided a sanitized version of the events. However, Terminal 4 also contains several high-definition encrypted government nodes used for facial recognition and threat detection by the TSA and the DoD. These nodes are not accessible to local police or private lawyers. She pulled a small silver drive from the pocket of her cardigan. This drive contains the raw, unedited feed from the government node directly above the priority seating area. It captures the entire incident in high resolution, including audio. The courtroom went silent as Tyler loaded the file. On the large monitors mounted on the walls, a new perspective of the terminal appeared. This wasn't the grainy, distant footage they had seen before. It was crystal clear. The jury watched in absolute silence as the audio picked up Victor Langford's voice, cold and mocking, telling his sons that the masses didn't matter. They saw the shove. They saw Roy, the bodyguard, grab the wheelchair and violently hurl Lena to the floor. The sound of her body hitting the tiles was much louder and more visceral than anyone had imagined, establishing a profound emotional connection between the jury and her suffering. Then they saw Logan. The footage showed him as a blur of calculated motion, his intervention not an act of rage, but a masterclass in proportional defense. They saw Coda pin the bodyguard with a discipline that was undeniable. The conflicting ideas of Logan as a trained killer vanished as the jury saw him shielding Lena with his own body, while the Langfords screamed lies at the arriving officers. As you can see, Lena continued, her voice cold and professional, the defendant acted with the restraint and precision expected of an active-duty Navy SEAL. The only criminals in that terminal were the men currently sitting in the second row. Before Margaret could even formulate an objection, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom were thrown open with a force that made the light fixtures rattle. This was in medias res, dropping the courtroom into a moment of dramatic action. Walking down the center aisle was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. He was wearing the dress-white uniform of a Navy commander, the silver oak leaves on his shoulders gleaming. This was Commander Marcus Hale, the commanding officer of a SEAL team. Behind him followed several other men, all in full-dress uniforms, their ribbons and medals creating a wall of military honors that made the entire room feel smaller. They moved with a synchronized rhythmic precision that commanded immediate respect. They didn't stop until they reached the front of the gallery, lining up behind Logan in a silent, unwavering show of solidarity. This was a strategic combination of multiple hooks, raising new questions while resolving old ones about Logan's character. Commander Hale didn't wait to be called. He stood at the bar, his voice deep and carrying the weight of command. Your Honor, I am here to provide immediate character testimony for Chief Petty Officer Logan Hale. Furthermore, I am here to inform the court that the Department of the Navy has taken an official interest in this case. We do not take lightly the false imprisonment and defamation of our elite operators, nor the attempted destruction of a decorated military working dog. The atmosphere in the room had changed from a trial to a reckoning. The Langfords were no longer the powerful family in control. They were small, petty bullies facing the combined might of the United States military and the truth of a Pentagon analyst. The jury was no longer looking at Logan with suspicion. They were looking at him with the awe reserved for a man who had been betrayed by the very people he fought to protect. Lena looked down from the stand at Logan, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. The hook had been set, and the truth was pulling them all toward a conclusion that no amount of money could buy. The defense had moved from a pile of details to a narrative of honor. The only thing left was for the gavel to fall. The silence that followed Dr. Lena Vargas's testimony was not the hollow quiet of an empty room, but the heavy pressurized silence of a bomb about to detonate. On the high-definition monitors, the truth remained frozen in a crystal-clear frame. Lena on the floor, the Langford family looking on with indifference, and Logan Hale standing as a solitary wall of protection. Judge Eleanor Graves looked down from her bench, her expression no longer neutral, but sharpened by the cold edge of judicial fury. She turned her gaze to the prosecution table, where Margaret Shaw was frantically whispering to her assistants, her previously unshakable confidence now a pile of scattered papers and desperate glances. The Langfords' lead counsel, Damien, sat so still he looked like a wax figure, his face drained of every drop of color. He knew that in a court of law, you can argue against interpretation, but you cannot argue against high-resolution government surveillance. "Commander Hale," Judge Graves said, her voice echoing with a new, resonant authority. "Please take the stand." The room watched as Commander Marcus Hale, a man whose skin looked like weathered leather and whose eyes held the weight of countless missions, stepped up to the witness box. He moved with a precision that made the very air seem to snap to attention. He didn't look at the lawyers or the gallery. He looked only at Logan, a brief, sharp nod of recognition passing between them. Hale was the kind of leader who didn't need a microphone to be heard. His voice was a low rumble that felt as though it were vibrating the mahogany floorboards. "Chief Petty Officer Logan Hale is not just an operator under my command," Hale began, his words measured and heavy. "He is the standard by which we measure the term protector. He has spent over a decade in the shadows of this world, ensuring that people like the Langford family can sleep in their expensive beds without ever knowing the names of the men who keep them safe. His training is not a weapon of aggression. It is a tool of surgical restraint. What you saw in that video was not an assault. It was the highest form of military discipline applied to a domestic crisis." Hale leaned forward, his hands resting flat on the railing. "The Department of the Navy has conducted its own internal review of the incident in Terminal 4. We have found that Chief Hale followed every protocol of engagement. He identified a vulnerable non-combatant being assaulted by a superior force, and he neutralized that force using the minimum amount of physical intervention required. To treat him as a criminal is an insult to the uniform he wears, and to attempt to destroy his working dog, a canine who has saved the lives of men in the field, is a moral failing that this office will not overlook." The commander's testimony acted as a powerful emotional hook, finally resolving the questions of Logan's character that the prosecution had tried so hard to distort. Margaret Shaw stood up, her voice trembling slightly for the first time in her career. "Your Honor, despite the impressive nature of the witness, the fact remains that physical injuries occurred." Judge Graves didn't even let her finish the sentence. "Sit down, Ms. Shaw," the judge commanded, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I have seen enough. The evidence provided by Dr. Vargas is irrefutable. The testimony provided by Commander Hale is definitive. This court was presented with a narrative of violence that has been proven to be a work of fiction, manufactured to protect the vanity of those who believe they are above the law." She looked at the jury, who were nodding in unison, their faces filled with a mixture of shame and indignation. "In the matter of the State versus Logan Hale," Judge Graves announced, her gavel held high, "all charges are dismissed with prejudice. Chief Hale, you are free to go. Furthermore, this court issues an immediate emergency stay on the euthanasia order for the canine Coda. He is to be returned to the custody of the Navy SEALs immediately." The gavel struck the wooden block with a sound that felt like a thunderclap, signaling the end of the Langfords' reign of lies. The courtroom didn't erupt in cheers. Instead, the team of SEALs stood in a silent, synchronized movement, their backs straight and their heads held high. It was a display of honor that transcended the legal victory. But the justice was not yet complete. Judge Graves turned her attention to the second row. "Mr. Victor Langford, Mr. Roy Baxter, and the young men involved do not leave this courtroom. Based on the video evidence provided by Dr. Vargas, I am referring this matter to the district attorney for immediate investigation into charges of felony assault, perjury, and the obstruction of justice. Officers, please take them into custody for processing." The shift in power was instantaneous. Two bailiffs, who had previously been leading Logan in handcuffs, now walked toward the Langford family. Victor Langford tries to speak, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came out. His sons looked terrified, their designer clothes suddenly looking like the costumes of children who had been caught in a terrible game. Roy, the bodyguard, lowered his head as the metal cuffs clicked around his wrists. They were led out of the side door, the same door Logan had used days before. their exit marked by the silence of a crowd that had finally seen the truth. A short while later, the side door of the courtroom opened again, and a familiar rhythmic panting filled the air. Coda, freed from his concrete cage at the animal shelter, surged into the room. He didn't bark. He simply flew across the floor, his tail a blur of sable fur. He didn't stop until his front paws were on Logan's chest, his head buried in the man's neck. Logan, the man who had faced mortar fire and shrapnel without flinching, knelt on the floor and pulled the dog into a crushing embrace. His eyes closed as he felt the steady, familiar heartbeat of his partner. Lena watched from her chair, her eyes wet with tears, as the warrior and his dog were made whole again. As Logan and Lena prepared to leave the courthouse, they found a sea of dress uniforms waiting for them on the steps. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows across the stone pillars. Commander Hale and the rest of the SEAL team had formed a corridor of honor. As Logan pushed Lena's wheelchair through the center, every man in uniform brought his hand to his brow in a slow, solemn salute. They weren't just saluting a chief petty officer, they were saluting the woman who had used her brilliance to save one of their own. Logan stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked up at the sky, the cold weight of the last few weeks finally lifting from his shoulders. He looked at Lena, who reached up and squeezed his hand. "Where to now, Chief?" she asked with a soft smile. Logan looked at Coda, who was sitting proudly at his side, and then back at the woman who had changed everything. "Home," he said, his voice steady and clear. "We're going home." They moved forward together, leaving the darkness of the courtroom behind, walking toward a future where honor was no longer a liability, but a shield. The story of Logan, Lena, and Coda is a powerful reminder that true strength is not measured by the size of your bank account or the volume of your voice. It is measured by your willingness to stand up for those who cannot stand for themselves. In a world where money and influence often try to rewrite the truth, this story teaches us that honor, integrity, and the unbreakable bond between a soldier and his loyal dog will always outshine the darkest lies. Privilege may try to intimidate the innocent, but the courage of righteous people will eventually shatter the walls of corruption. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the profound value of sacrifice and justice, please share this video with your friends and family. Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of faith and courage. May God bless you and your loved ones with peace, unwavering strength, and the bravery to always do what is right. Please type Amen in the comments if you believe that truth will always prevail. Thank you so much for spending your time with us today. Remember, even the smallest acts of courage can change someone's world. Stay blessed, stay brave, and we'll see you in the next story.